I'm now joined by former Texas Congressman and the founder of Powered by People, Beto O'Rourke. Welcome back to Pod Save America, Beto.
John, it's so good to see you. I wish this were in person, but it's still good to see you across the screen.
It's good to see you too. First question. Saw some pretty wild polls in your state this morning. Is this the year we're turning Texas blue? Is it going to happen?
It is. So it's been 44 years. Last time it happened was in 1976, almost half a century, since a Democrat won the Electoral College votes in Texas. But the poll I saw this morning, probably same one you're referring to, Biden, 48, Trump, 48. And it doesn't mean that Biden's going to do it. It just means that it is fully possible and within our power to make it so. And so there are, as you know, so many amazing state house candidates in Texas, congressional candidates in Texas, a revived Texas Democratic Party, so many people doing what they can to make the most of this opportunity. And I really think that we have no better shot of ending this on election night, given the fact that Pennsylvania will take maybe days or weeks to count their ballots. Then for Texas, 38 electoral college votes the night of November 3rd to come in for the Democrat for the first time in a half century. And mathematically, and then maybe more importantly, psychologically, it becomes impossible for Trump to move forward. And we turn the page on that and start something new and ambitious and perhaps the most progressive administration in the history of this country. So a lot, I believe, is riding on Texas.
So I want to talk all about the state legislative races, but just before we get there, from a statewide perspective, your race against Cruz, you got to 48%. Like, how does a Democrat in Texas get that extra 2%? If you had to do it all over again, if you were running statewide again, where would you look for those votes?
Well, a couple things. One, since I ran, anywhere from 800,000 to 900,000 Texans have become registered to vote. So there's almost an entirely new electorate in the state. It tends to be young. It tends to be incredibly diverse. It tends to be concentrated in North Texas around the DFW Metroplex and Southeast Texas around Houston. So connect with those young voters and those new Texans who've moved here from other states and those new registrants. I don't know, John, going to 254 counties and making sure no one was written off, no one was taken for granted. We ran that pretty hard. And not only did we have the best turnout in the midterm since 1970 in the state of Texas, not only did I win more votes than any Democrat had ever won, you had 500,000 people, 500,000 vote for Greg Abbott for governor, voted for me for U.S. Senate, which has something to do with the campaign we ran, may have a lot to do with Ted Cruz and just how vile a human being he is. And I think that we're actually working with a similar dynamic here. Unfortunately, more than 16,000 of my fellow Texans have lost their lives. Most of them did not need to do that. We represent 4% of the world's population as a country. We're a fifth of the world's deaths. This is 100% attributable to Donald Trump, those who've enabled him like John Cornyn, and those who are following in his footsteps like our governor, Greg Abbott. And that is not lost on the voters of this state. They are connecting the dots. And so I think that poll that shows what is possible, if we all are doing our part, connecting with those voters, if Joe Biden follows up on this really impressive investment he's made, $6 million, which is probably $6 million more than any Democratic nominee for president has spent in Texas, at least on the air, in decades, we could really come through for the country. So I think building upon the great work that everyone did in 2018, the great contrast we have with Trump and the Republican Party, and then making sure that people know what the consequence of another 4 years of Trump is, and then what's possible with the 4 years of Biden and Harris.
Can you talk about why you started Powered by People and what kind of work you've been doing since last fall?
Yeah, I think the most exciting level of government, especially in Texas right now, is the state legislature. This is where the rubber meets the road when you're talking about access to healthcare. We're the least insured state in the country. Number one provider of mental health care is the county jail system. Largest inpatient mental health care facility is the Harris County Jail. We elected not to expand Medicaid when the federal government was going to pay 100 cents on the dollar in order to do that. And therefore, many Texans are far sicker than they otherwise would be, are dying, and they don't have to. That state legislature in Democratic control could expand Medicaid, and therefore the ability to see a doctor and save somebody's life. We are on the front lines of climate change here in energy-rich Texas that could be the leader in renewable energy, and that would be a decision for the state legislature. We are at the front lines of gun violence. El Paso, Midland, Odessa, Sutherland Springs, Santa Fe High School, so many mass shootings have taken place here in Texas. We expanded the ability to carry guns on campuses and in churches and in businesses in the wake of those shootings. Having gun sense candidates who can appeal to gun owners and non-gun owners alike, that becomes possible with the Democratic majority. And then this, and you all have been so focused on this, and we are grateful. You know, Greg Abbott last week closing down all of the absentee ballot drop-off locations in the 254 Texas counties, save for the one at central headquarters in each county. That, compounded by the most rigorous voter ID laws, 750 polling place closures, most of them located in Black and Latino neighborhoods over the last 8 years, the racial gerrymander that is Texas, and those are the words of a federal judge, not mine. You get a Democratic majority with a seat at the table in 2021 when we redistrict this state and draw in 3 new congressional districts thanks to our population growth. And you get a democracy that begins to work again, not one that has drawn Black Texans and Mexican-American Texans out solely based on the color of their skin or their country of national origin, but one that reveals its true genius through its diversity. We have been held back for so long. Not a red state, not a Republican state, not a blue state, just a non-voting state up to this point. And winning the state legislature changes all that. And one other thing, I think there is, my theory of the case, to use a phrase I often associate with you, is that instead of top-down coattails, you know, a big spend from the top of the ticket, lots of organizing statewide, and the votes trickle down, we're going to have all these great state house candidates who, by the way, most of them are women of color, and many Black women among them. They are enlarging the electorate. They're registering new voters. They're exciting these new voters. They're bringing people in who otherwise would not vote. And those voters and votes will travel up ballot to the congressional races, to the U.S. Senate race where MJ Hagar could beat John Cornyn. And I think they, more than any other factor or force, will help Joe Biden win this state. So Powered by People is really just a bunch of us volunteers, more than 6,000 of us, making phone calls, writing postcards, texting. Pre-COVID, we were knocking on doors to reach the voters in these competitive state house districts that can decide the outcomes of these elections. And it is pretty thrilling. It reminds me a lot of the 2018 campaign, just very grassroots, folks taking the matter into their own hands, calling complete strangers and bringing them in, and hopefully producing the largest turnout we've seen in a presidential election cycle ever.
And how are voters responding to this? Because traditionally, at least for the last decade, last several years, it's been really hard to get people to focus on sort of down ballot races, local races. Like, how much sort of education do you have to do when you're talking to voters about, like, this is a state legislative race that's really important that you should focus on?
Yeah. So I'm on all these phone banks that we do. And I got to tell you, and you know this from doing this kind of work, it's not necessarily fun. And it's certainly not easy. You might be getting the wrong number.
Yeah.
Yeah. You might be getting somebody in the middle of dinner. You may just have somebody who doesn't want to talk about this with a complete stranger on the phone. But when I get the right person at the right number and they take the time to talk with me, the most gratifying response I get is, I didn't know that Elisa Simmons was running for state house here in Arlington. I didn't know about Akila Basie or Kiki Williams. She is running just outside of Fort Hood in a community that hasn't been represented by a Democrat in I don't know how long. 24-year Army veteran running this tenacious campaign. And when I connect with voters in her district, they are thrilled that she's running. They didn't know a Democrat was running. They didn't know that they had a 24-year Army veteran to choose. And that's when I know that these calls make a difference, that you might otherwise have had somebody in a state that just ended straight ticket voting for this cycle. You might have people who vote for the presidential race, maybe the U.S. Senate, and then go home. They're now going to stay on that ballot 6 pages later and vote for that state rep candidate. So I know that this works. I know it is tough, but if this stuff were easy, we'd be a blue state already. And it's going to take this kind of work to bring it home.
And just from a numbers perspective, how close are you guys to flipping the legislature? How many seats? How close is it?
Yeah, so we are, thanks to the great work everyone did in 2018, where we picked up 12 state house seats, we are only 9 down. And the great thing is, in 9 of those districts that we want to win, I actually won more votes than did Ted Cruz. So in that case, in that year in 2018, folks just didn't complete the job and go down the ballot. So we know we can turn out Democratic voters in sufficient numbers to win these races. So we've got to win those. We've got to hold the ones that we picked up in 2018. But what's so exciting is that we are contesting everywhere. And I just think it's beautiful. There's a guy, Jason Rogers, a Democrat running in East Texas in a seat that hasn't seen a Democrat run in like 20 or 30 years. He is an Army veteran. He's a retired public school teacher, and he's currently a diesel mechanic. And he's talking to the people in his district in a way that they can understand, that kind of transcends party or ideology or your pre-held conceptions about what a Democrat is or is not. And I don't know if Jason Rogers is going to win. I think he's got a shot. But what he is going to do is he's going to bring in more voters than would otherwise turn out, because there hasn't been a contest there in decades. And those voters are going to go right up the ballot to Joe Biden. So it's pretty cool to see what's happening across the board and across the state in Texas right now.
You guys are hosting a million voter phone bank on Monday, October 12th. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, this is going to be really fun. And I think the biggest voter phone bank we've seen in Texas, certainly that I've been a part of. We're going to try to call 1 million voters that we have already identified, because powered by people, the Texas Democratic Party, the candidates themselves have made tens of millions of voter contact attempts. We've identified our voters. Now we got to turn them out. So on Monday, the 12th of October, which is the eve of early voting, which starts the next day on Tuesday, we're going to try to call 1 million known Democratic voters and get them to make a commitment to vote on the first day of early voting, thereby avoiding any long lines on November 3rd, making sure that they get their votes in. We're going to be joined by Oprah Winfrey, Willie Nelson, Bernie Sanders, Stacey Abrams, Julian Castro, Andrew Yang, and a bunch of other amazing
What a crew.
people.
What a crew.
Right?
Yeah,
so
I like that.
I'm so pumped to be a part of this, and so grateful that these folks who have such a large following and are so concerned about the state of our democracy and the need to vote are willing to lend their names and their time to this as well. So the million voter phone bank on Monday, the 12th of October.
So you guys have had a number of obstacles to overcome. You've talked about some of them. Pandemics made it harder to organize and register voters. You mentioned, like, every other day I see a story in the news about some other Republican voter suppression tactic in Texas. How are you dealing with all this shit, both from like a tactical perspective and also from a psychological perspective for voters to feel like, oh, everything's stacked up against us. What can I do?
Yeah, great question. I mean, you got to go in eyes wide open. You have to acknowledge that voter suppression is alive and well in Texas, so that you know what you're walking into. And I mentioned the polling place closures and the voter ID laws. You can use your license to carry a firearm in Texas to prove who you are at your precinct. You can't use your student ID as an example. And this latest move by Greg Abbott to close down the absentee ballot collection sites is just more of it. But if we leave it there, then all we've done is kind of depress people and inadvertently and unwittingly help those Republicans suppress the vote. So let's talk about this. In Harris County, which is home to Houston, Texas, which has more people in it than the state of Colorado or the state of Nevada, has 2,000 square miles, más o menos. They've got 24-hour voting. They have voter super centers where you can keep, safe distance and very convenient and can accommodate a lot of people. They have drive-through voting, so you don't have to leave your car. And Chris Hollins, who is the county clerk there, has implemented a ballot tracker for those who want to entrust their absentee ballot to the U.S. mails. They'll track that and confirm when they have received it. So many of these counties, most of them led by Democrats, are making it incredibly easy for people to vote nonetheless. And that's how we're going to overcome this desperate attempt to suppress or intimidate voters. We're not going to allow them to do that. And so I think we have to keep continuing to share that message about how easy so many in so many counties have made it to vote. And then we've got to also, beyond voting, beyond expressing our outrage about voter suppression on Twitter, we've got to do some of the hard work, the grind of a voter phone bank. I mean, this stuff is not fun, and it's not easy, but it's necessary. And it's the only way, certainly in the midst of COVID, the only sure way we have of connecting with those whose votes will decide the outcome of these elections. And so we certainly encourage anyone who's interested. You can be a Texan, you can be outside of the state of Texas, to join us on Monday the 12th on the Million Voter Phone Bank and reach those Texans who, folks, will not only decide whether we have a Democratic majority in the state house, will not only decide the most competitive congressional landscape in Texas in my lifetime, but will also potentially decide whether this election is over on the night of November 3rd and whether Joe Biden becomes the first Democrat to win Texas in 44 years. That's how important these phone calls are.
So when you're on these phone calls, when you're talking to voters, and you're talking to people who are either undecided between candidates or uncertain about whether they'll vote at all, what have you found to be the most persuasive arguments?
You know what? This is one of the toughest conversations I have, because it's hard for me, given everything I know and have witnessed and have participated in, to believe that anybody could be undecided at this point. But
but they're out there.
They're out there. And I had an experience with a voter. Congresswoman Veronica Escobar organized a series of phone banks that were calling voters along the U.S.-Mexico border. So, communities that are 95% Mexican-American. Voters who may prefer to speak in English, may prefer to speak in Spanish. And I caught one guy who was at work. He was at Circle K, convenience store. And in Texas, the minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. So this may be his second or third job. And he said, I'm undecided. I don't have time for this shit. I've got to get back to work. I've got a lot going on in my life right now. And that helped me understand how some don't have the luxury to get as engaged as I've been able to get engaged in the news, in politics, in democracy. And then I have to also acknowledge that as a Mexican-American man, I mean, his vote has been actively suppressed for a very long time. And in some ways, we've got to work to help him to overcome that. So that outreach, and he mentioned to me, you're the first call I've ever had from a candidate or a campaign or anything political. So I will at least think about it. That was important. And then part of why I think it's so critical that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and their surrogates campaign in Texas is that I am hearing from a lot of Mexican-American voters, a lot of Black voters in Texas who aren't sure that they're going to vote. And some say, I feel like I'm supposed to vote for the Democrat because I'm Black and that's what's expected of me. But, if someone doesn't come and ask for my vote, then I'm not so sure that I will. And as great a job as the Texas Democratic Party and our candidates and volunteers are doing, nothing will beat Joe Biden, the man who will be in the position of public trust that will determine the future and fate of this country. Nothing will beat him coming to Texas and making that case here. So we are so grateful for everything that he is doing so far, this investment that they're making, the fact that Doug Emhoff was just in the Rio Grande Valley, which is not an easy place to get to, but it is so critically important that we show up in places like McAllen or Harlingen. But to have more of that is just going to improve our chances of winning. These voters know what they can vote against. These voters desperately want something and someone to vote for.
Yeah, no, that's been my experience talking to these same voters. So I follow you on Twitter. I notice you've been laser focused on organizing in Texas. You haven't commented a ton about Trump and the race, which kudos to you. That's a lot more productive what you're doing. But I've been curious, what's your reaction been to the last several weeks of this race, from the debate to the COVID diagnosis to the insanity that we're dealing with right now?
Yeah, I was I don't know another word to put on it. The night of and the morning after that debate, I was just depressed, and not depressed about our chances, just depressed that this is what the country has come to, and that something like that could even take place. And it is a very defeating feeling. I mean, it's hard to motivate yourself to get out there and move and do something. And, I almost thought maybe that's the mad genius of Donald Trump, that it is just such a blizzard of bizarre behavior, just such an awful train wreck that it depresses us from moving and getting past it, or getting through it, or getting over it, or getting beyond it. And it really wasn't until we had a phone bank that night. And, I always kind of, have to kind of gear up for those phone banks, because, not only am I calling strangers, but sometimes, as Beto O'Rourke, people want to give you a piece of their mind, and I'm going to receive that for 2.5 hours on the phones. But I finished that phone bank, and man, I felt so much better. You feel a sense of agency and purpose, and you're not a witness, you're not a bystander. This isn't happening to you. You're going to happen to it. You're going to change the dynamic. And look, you're one person. Maybe over the course of that phone bank, you made 115, 120 phone calls. But in the aggregate, when you're joined by 400, 500, 600 other people doing it at the same time, and then Kate on our team gives us the rundown of, here's how many calls we made, here's how many voters we talked to, here's how many commitments we got for Biden or for the Democratic State House candidate. Man, that feels so good. And I got to remind myself of that whenever I get down or distressed or on the verge of despair. Go out and do some work. And if you can find a safe way to knock on doors, and I know the Biden campaign is going to start doing that, or if you can join one of these phone banks, or if you can talk to someone in your life and gain a commitment from them to make a plan to vote as soon as early voting starts in their state, then by all means do it. It's the only way, John, I know how to respond to that, because it is just too bizarre. The roid rage of the president these last couple of days, the walking away from literally hundreds of millions of Americans who need help getting through the deadliest pandemic of the last 102 years, the millions of Texans who lost their job. Twice as many Texans filed for unemployment in the first 2 months of this pandemic as did in all of 2019. And man, they are struggling and suffering. The Rio Grande Valley, so many people have died so quickly of COVID that they are stacking the dead bodies in refrigerated FEMA trailers because there is no more room in the morgues and the funeral homes. Donald Trump walked away from each and every single one of them, everyone who needs our government to come through for us at this moment. And I can't control that. And I don't know the effective response in real time, except to make sure he is not our president on the 21st of January, 2021.
I said the same exact thing the day after the debate to our staff, is that like his bet is that you will be so disgusted with politics that you will just tune out and stay home. And we have to remember that we have the power to change that we have agency in the outcome of this race, that we don't have to let him have the last word by making us so disgusted about politics that we stay home, because we have the power to change it by going to vote and volunteering and making those phone calls. On that note, if people want to help, if people want to be part of the Million Voter Phone Bank on Monday, October 12th, they want to help Powered by People, what should they do? Where should they go?
So the website is poweredbypeople.org. It's spelled a little funny. It's powered and then X people, poweredxpeople.org. You go there, you can sign up for any number of shifts on the Million Voter Phone Bank. You can sign up for the shift with Willie Nelson, with Oprah Winfrey, with Andrew Yang, with Julian Castro, with Stacey Abrams, with Bernie Sanders. All of these great people who understand how important Texas is for the future of our country. You can get on the phones with them. So it's poweredbypeople.org, and we would love to have you making phone calls with us on Monday.
Outstanding. Beto O'Rourke, thank you so much for coming back to PSA, and thanks for all the wonderful work you're doing, and good luck out there.
Thank you, man. Thanks for having me on, and thank you for what you all are doing.
Thanks to Beto for joining, and after listening to him talk about how important it is to flip the Texas state legislature, we're making a big addition to Fuck Jerry. We're going to add Texas. As Beto mentioned, to flip the Texas House, Democrats need to just flip 9 Republican seats and not lose any Democrats. and they can do it entirely with districts that Beto won in 2018. So to support the most flippable Texas House seats, we're working with Future Now Fund to ensure that your contributions are spent in a way that can support as many candidates as possible. Go to votesaveamerica.com/fuckjerry and donate today to help flip Texas.